There are certain figures in rock and roll history who don't just participate in the music, they become the music. Joan Jett is one of those rare human beings. For more than 5 decades, she has stood at the intersection of rebellion and artistry, leather jacket cinched tight, guitar slung low, daring the world to tell her she doesn't belong, and for 5 decades, the world has tried. Critics dismissed her. Record labels slammed their doors in her face. Audiences spat on her literally. Yet here she stands, at 66 years old, still rocking, still refusing to apologize, and finally, after all these years, ready to speak openly about the secret she has carried for the better part of her extraordinary life. To understand the secret, you first have to understand the woman. And to understand the woman, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a quiet suburb in Pennsylvania. Back to a Christmas morning. Back to the moment a teenage girl unwrapped a guitar and felt, for the very first time, that she had found her purpose. Joan Marie Larkin was born on September 22, 1958, in Wynwood, Pennsylvania. She was a quiet kid in many ways, but something burned inside her that couldn't be quieted by suburban life, by school routines, or by the social expectations placed on girls growing up in the late 1960s and early 1970s. When her family gifted her that first guitar at age 13, it wasn't just a present, it was a revelation. But the very first guitar lesson she ever took came wrapped in a cruel message, delivered without hesitation: girls can't play rock and roll. Those 5 words could have ended everything before it started. For a lesser spirit they might have. But Joan Jett, who would soon shed her birth surname and replace it with one that crackled like electricity, was not a lesser spirit. She absorbed the rejection, and she used it as fuel. Her family relocated to West Covina, California, and it was there, in the sprawling, sun-drenched landscape of Southern California, that young Joan began to find her people. She started frequenting Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco on Sunset Boulevard, an all-ages glam rock club that served as a gathering place for the creative and the bold. It was there that she crafted her look: black leather, black eyeliner, a shag haircut drawn straight from the influence of rock trailblazer Suzi Quatro. And it was there that everything that would define her life began to take shape. She has spoken warmly about what Quatro meant to her in those formative years. Seeing a woman command a stage with a bass guitar and an attitude that refused to ask for permission, it cracked something open in young Joan. It proved, against all the voices telling her otherwise, that girls could do this, that she could do this. And if she could, then there were probably other girls out there feeling the same hunger, the same frustration, the same fire. That realization didn't just shape a career, it shaped a movement. At Bingenheimer's club, Joan met drummer Sandy West, brought together through producer Kim Fowley, a colorful and controversial figure in the Los Angeles music world. Fowley had an idea: a teenage all-female rock band. The concept was bold, possibly outrageous by the standards of mid-1970s rock culture, and that was precisely what made it exciting. Through various configurations and auditions, the lineup eventually crystallized around Joan Jett, Sandy West, lead guitarist Lita Ford, bassist Jackie Fox, and lead vocalist Cherie Currie. They called themselves the Runaways, and they were about to drag rock and roll into uncharted territory. Joan and Fowley co-wrote much of the band's material, including the song that would become their signature anthem, Cherry Bomb. The Runaways weren't interested in being polished pop princesses. They wanted grit. They wanted sweat. In a 2010 interview, Joan laid out their ambition plainly. They wanted to be the female equivalent of Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones. They wanted to play dirty, sexy, ferocious rock and roll. And they did. But the world wasn't ready. The tabloid press reduced them to their gender and their youth, running headlines that focused on their appearance rather than their music. Audiences in certain venues responded with outright hostility. Joan has spoken candidly about standing on stage while crowds spat at her, finishing shows drenched and humiliated, sitting backstage with her head in her hands afterward. But she never walked off that stage on her own. She made clear that the only way anyone was getting her off was to physically carry her. No amount of hostility was going to scare her away from the music she loved. The Runaways released 5 albums in 4 years and toured internationally, achieving genuine fame in Australia and Japan, where their reception rivaled the kind of mass hysteria that had greeted the Beatles a decade earlier. But behind the scenes, things were fracturing badly. Kim Fowley's management of the band was increasingly toxic. Band members and their families have described in documentary footage how he denied the girls access to education and healthcare, deliberately sowed division among them, and manipulated them financially. The internal tensions, combined with member changes and the weight of years of relentless touring and mistreatment, eventually brought the Runaways to their inevitable end. Their final performance took place on New Year's Eve 1978 in San Francisco. Joan saw it coming. She has described feeling cut off from a growing alliance between some band members and a new producer, sensing that the thing she had helped build from the ground up was slipping away from her. Rather than wait to be pushed out, she stepped aside. But it broke her. The dissolution of the Runaways sent Joan Jett into a dark period. By her own admission, she dealt with the grief and anger by drinking heavily, starting early in the morning and pushing through the day on fury and alcohol. She was furious at a world that had given women so little room in rock and roll, furious that something she had fought so hard to create had fallen apart, furious at her own uncertainty about what came next. But even in that darkness, the music refused to let her go. During this period, she connected with producer and manager Kenny Laguna, who would become one of the most important figures of her career. Laguna saw something in Joan that the rest of the industry seemed determined to ignore. She recorded a self-titled debut album, shopping it across the American music industry with hope. That hope was met with one of the most remarkable rejection streaks in rock history. 23 record labels said no. 23 doors closed in her face. By the standards of the industry, she was done before she started A Woman, playing rock, without the backing of a major label, after the collapse of a band that critics had already largely dismissed. On paper, there was no reason to keep going. Joan Jett and Kenny Laguna kept going. Together, they founded Blackheart Records, an independent label born out of necessity and defiance in equal measure. Laguna sold copies of her debut album out of the trunk of his car at shows, and the demand from fans was overwhelming. The industry had said no, but the audience hadn't. The people who loved loud guitars and honest emotion and a woman who refused to be diminished, they said yes, loudly and persistently. Blackheart Records wasn't just a business decision, it was a declaration of independence. It was Joan Jett refusing once again to disappear. She assembled a new band, the Blackhearts, choosing to work with male musicians, partly because forming another all-female group felt to her like it would have been a betrayal of something sacred, and partly because she was determined to operate on the same terms as any male rock act, without the gender-based framing that had plagued the Runaways. The band began playing around Los Angeles before heading to Europe and eventually settling in New York. Her debut album was released under the title Bad Reputation on Boardwalk Records, and the lead single of the same name became something close to a manifesto. Ranked by VH1 among the greatest hard rock songs ever recorded, Bad Reputation was a direct, unflinching response to every person who had ever tried to limit her. Its lyrics spoke of a woman doing exactly what she wanted, not caring about judgment, refusing to change. It was autobiography set to a power chord. It was defiant, joyful, and absolutely necessary. Then came I Love Rock and Roll. Released in 1981, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts' album of the same name changed everything. The title track, a cover of an Arrow song that Joan had been playing live for years, became one of the defining singles of the early 1980s. It sat at the top of the Billboard Hot 100 for 7 consecutive weeks and was one of the biggest songs of 1982. The album sold 10 million copies. The accompanying music video, featuring Joan and the Blackhearts prowling through a dimly lit bar with attitude dripping from every frame, received constant rotation on the newly launched MTV. Almost overnight, the woman who had been rejected by 24 record labels was one of the biggest names in American rock. Publications that had ignored or belittled her were suddenly writing glowing profiles. The revenge, as one headline put it, was in the sales figures. 1982 brought further hits. Her cover of Crimson and Clover stood out in particular for an artistic decision that spoke volumes about Joan's character. She kept the original pronouns, singing openly about her love for a woman at a time when such choices carried real professional risk. It was not an accident. It was not an oversight. It was a choice, deliberate and clear, made by a woman who had been communicating her truth in every available way for years. And that brings us to what many have described as Joan Jett's long-kept secret, though calling it a secret perhaps misunderstands the situation. Joan Jett has never hidden who she is. What she has done, carefully and consistently, is refuse to let anyone else define it for her, label it in their terms, or use it as a headline to overshadow her music. Throughout her career, she's been a beloved icon within the LGBTQIA+ community. Former Runaways vocalist Cherie Currie revealed in documentary interviews that she and Joan had a romantic relationship during their time in the band, a story that was later dramatized in the 2010 biographical film, The Runaways. Joan served as executive producer on that film. She did not hide from that story. She helped bring it to screens. In a 1994 interview with Out magazine, Joan described her sexuality as all-inclusive and told readers simply to assume away when it came to questions about her personal life. She has worn jewelry bearing women's symbols interlinked, has displayed a matching tattoo on her lower back, and when a journalist from the New York Times questioned in 2018 why her documentary was screening at Outfest, given that she had never officially come out, Joan lifted her necklace toward the camera and responded with barely contained disbelief. What more, she seemed to be asking, could possibly be needed? The symbols were there, the tattoo was there, the music had been there for decades. The secret, then, was never really hidden. It was simply waiting for the world to catch up to what Joan had been expressing all along. In an era when being openly queer in rock and roll carried enormous professional consequences, when radio stations could blacklist you, when labels could drop you, when audiences could turn hostile, Joan Jett communicated her truth through her art, her imagery, and her deliberate artistic choices, including keeping those pronouns in Crimson and Clover. She did it on her own terms, in her own time, in her own language. And now, at 66, she speaks about it with the calm confidence of someone who never truly hid anything, someone who simply refused to perform a coming out for the convenience of a culture that wasn't ready to listen properly in the first place. Her later career continued to carry the same spirit. The 1988 album Up Your Alley marked a commercial comeback, going multi-platinum and earning a Grammy nomination for Best Hard Rock Performance. Its single I Hate Myself for Loving You climbed into the top 10. In 1987, she took on an acting role in the film Light of Day, starring alongside Michael J. Fox, and performed a title track written by Bruce Springsteen, later performing the song with Springsteen himself at a benefit concert following the September 11th attacks. Springsteen performing alongside Joan Jett is not an image of charity. It is one musician acknowledging another as a peer. It carries weight. Through all of it, through the commercial peaks and the fallow periods, through the label battles and the critical dismissals, through the controversies and the complications, Joan Jett never changed her fundamental self. She never softened her image to make radio programmers comfortable. She never adjusted her personal presentation to make journalists stop asking questions. She never stopped playing exactly the kind of music she wanted to play. When Kenny Laguna's daughter Carrie Ann Brinkman joined Blackheart Records in 2002, she became a new partner in Joan's continued evolution, helping guide the label and encouraging Joan to connect with new generations through ventures like the 26 Warped Tour and the production of the Bad Reputation documentary. As Brinkman has noted publicly, Joan's early experience of rejection and survival gave her an instinct for the hustle that remains essential to any artist trying to make it in a changing industry. In 2015, Joan Jett, Kenny Laguna, and the Blackhearts were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame essay written to mark her induction described her as the last American rock star. It is a phrase that lands with the weight it deserves in a